That's right. Well, 9 men and 3 women will decide the fate of Royce Ziegler. Today, jurors heard from a lieutenant with the Galveston County Sheriff's Office. He was one of the first people on the crime scene the night baby Riley's body was found.
Riley Ann Sawyers was a little girl who loved Elmo, the color pink, and playing in the snow. In the summer of 2007, she was living in a quiet Texas suburb with her mother. But when concerned relatives asked to see her, the story they were told didn't add up. What happened to this happy toddler, and why did the one person who should have protected her become the architect of her nightmare? To understand the tragedy, we must go back to where the story began, in a seemingly ordinary town with 2 teenagers about to become parents. Kimberly, Riley's mother, was born on August 9, 1988, and spent her childhood in Mentor, where she was known as a bright and driven student. Academically advanced, she was even positioned to finish high school unusually early. During gym class at Mentor High School, while casually walking laps, she crossed paths with Robert. A relationship developed, and by the age of 15, Kimberly was expecting a child. Both teens were enrolled in the GRADS program, short for Graduation, Reality, and Dual Support, which was designed to help young parents learn childcare basics while staying on track academically. Although her grades declined under the pressure, Kimberly did complete high school. Robert left school during his junior year to earn money at a machine shop, later completing his education by obtaining a GED. After Riley's birth, housing was provided by Robert's mother, Cheryl Sawyers, who welcomed her grandchild with enthusiasm. At first, Riley received consistent care from Kimberly, but tension slowly grew between the young parents. Whether caused by emotional strain, financial pressure, or the challenge of parenting as teenagers in a shared household, the relationship deteriorated. By October 2006, the engagement ended and the ring was returned. Despite the separation, Kimberly remained in the Sawyer household, a situation that quietly reflected how complicated growing up too fast can be. Robert soon began a new relationship with Catherine Peer, whom he had met through a bowling league. Catherine later became pregnant, and after being asked to leave her own home, she also moved into the Sawyers' house. Marriage followed. Unusually, the living arrangement included Robert, his wife, his mother, his former partner, and a toddler, an arrangement that sounded like the setup for a sitcom, minus the laugh track. Surprisingly, cooperation prevailed. Kimberly and Catherine formed a close bond, and Riley was often cared for by Catherine, who later recalled Riley as energetic, well-mannered, and full of life at just 2 years old. During this period, Kimberly was introduced by Robert to the online world of Warcraft, where she was shown how to create a digital identity separate from her everyday life. She learned to equip her character with spells, weapons, and abilities to battle imagined enemies across virtual landscapes. Gradually, long nighttime gaming sessions became routine. In that space, she was no longer a young mother relying on assistance and sharing a crowded household. She could instead be known as Firefly or Fiery, a respected member of a guild with missions and purpose. Each in-game achievement seemed to offer progress that reality was slower to provide. At times, the game held her attention so completely that meals were requested at the computer rather than shared at a table. During this phase, it appeared that Riley's daily care was largely handled by Cheryl, while Kimberly remained immersed in a world where leveling up was much simpler. Through the game, Kimberly formed a connection with another player whose character was a formidable warlock. Behind the screen was Royce 𝐂𝐨𝐧𝐭, a man 5 years her senior living in Houston, Texas. He spoke confidently about his work with a Shell oil contractor and described a life that sounded far more exciting than suburban routine. Kimberly mentioned Roy to the Sawyers, but the relationship raised little concern. When he later traveled to Ohio to visit her, the bond seemed confirmed, transforming an online friendship into something more tangible. In March 2007, a report involving domestic conflict was filed by Kimberly, alleging that an argument with Robert had escalated over a minor disagreement about parking. Robert denied any serious confrontation, and the matter was eventually reduced to a lesser charge. By May 23rd, the two returned to court, this time to determine custody of Riley. Without legal representation on either side, the decision resulted in Kimberly being granted custody. Soon after, she left the state with Riley without providing the court-required notice, quietly closing one chapter while opening another. Riley's grandmother, Cheryl Sawyers, later suggested that Roy's influence may have played a role in the sudden relocation. She reflected that, online, people can present themselves however they wish, and that Kimberly, still only 18, may have believed the version of life she was shown. To Cheryl, it seemed possible that an appealing picture had been painted, one bright enough to encourage a long-distance leap of faith. 6 days later, Kimberly reappeared in public records when she and Royce applied for a marriage license in Spring, Texas, where he had rented a house. They were married on June 1, 2007, in a brief civil ceremony, having met in person only twice. Kimberly later described her new life as stable and positive. Royce was employed, provided financial support, and even purchased a van. Royce's mother, Nellie Ziegler, met Kimberly that first June weekend, but learned of the marriage only weeks later. Although Nellie's husband expressed skepticism about what he called ready-made marriages, Nellie welcomed Kimberly and Riley into her home. She quickly formed a loving bond with Riley, now an outgoing toddler, and even offered childcare support so Kimberly could consider work or college. Proof that sometimes optimism arrives before reality has finished unpacking. Back in Ohio, the Sawyer family retained an attorney, Laura Deeds, who submitted multiple legal requests seeking Kimberly's return and clarification of Riley's location. Because legal custody was not held by the Sawyers, these motions were denied. Kimberly did briefly come back to Ohio for a child support hearing, but she kept details of her living situation private and did not disclose her marriage. Riley was said to be with her father at the time. Following the hearing, Kimberly vanished once more, though records later showed she had secured a Texas driver's license shortly afterward. Efforts to locate Kimberly and Riley continued, with the Sawyers reaching out to acquaintances and relatives. Kimberly's family suggested several possible states where she might be staying, though none of the leads proved accurate. Progress was finally made when Kimberly's Texas identification surfaced through legal channels. Even then, serving court documents remained unsuccessful, and access to Riley was denied. Phone calls were deflected with explanations that Riley was either outside playing or asleep, always unavailable, always just out of reach. What had begun as a storybook romance seemed to drift away from fantasy as Roy's approach to parenting emerged. Formal manners were demanded from a toddler, and strict obedience was emphasized as essential. Physical discipline was promoted as a teaching method, mirroring what Roy himself had experienced growing up. Accounts from his family suggested this style of punishment had long been normalized, even when it crossed reasonable boundaries. This model of authority appeared to be applied to Riley, as though childhood could be trained away through firmness alone. During a visit in June, Roy's mother, Nellie Ziegler, stopped by with groceries and noted a delay before the door was answered. When Kimberly appeared, a belt was visible over her shoulder. Not long after, while tending to Riley, Nellie noticed concerning marks and reacted with immediate anger and worry. She later confronted the couple, making her objections clear. Assurances were given that such discipline would stop, and afterward no further signs were observed, at least none that Nellie was allowed to see. Soon visits became rare. Explanations about Riley's whereabouts shifted from staying with a coworker to claims involving child services. Nellie was left with unanswered questions and mounting concern, wondering how a child who once filled her home with laughter could so suddenly disappear. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Riley's father and grandparents remained locked in unsuccessful legal efforts, waiting for answers that never came. On October 29, 2007, along the Texas shoreline of Galveston Bay, a fisherman came across a sealed plastic container on a remote island. Inside was the remains of a very young child. Authorities determined the child was a female toddler, and an examination revealed severe head injuries consistent with extreme trauma. The case was immediately treated as a criminal investigation, and further analysis was conducted to establish the cause. What had begun with online avatars and imagined heroism ended far from any fantasy, an outcome no one had leveled up enough to escape. Because of the condition of the remains, investigators were unable to determine the precise time of the child's passing, though it was established that at least 2 weeks had elapsed. The Galveston County Sheriff's Office led the case and requested assistance from the FBI, while also appealing directly to the public. To humanize the investigation and encourage recognition, the child was given the temporary name Baby Grace, a name chosen to remind the public that this was not just a mystery, but a child who had once been known and loved. Authorities released a physical description based on forensic findings. Baby Grace was believed to be a white child between the ages of 2 and 3. She had long, wavy hair that appeared blonde or light brown, stood just over 2.5 feet tall, and weighed roughly 25 to 30 pounds. At the time she was found, she was wearing a pink skirt sold by Target, a pink or red top, and white light-up Velcro sneakers decorated with small flowers. Major Ray Tuttle-Mondo of the Sheriff's Office emphasized the emotional weight of the case, noting that calls were coming in steadily. Hope remained that one would finally bring answers. He explained that Baby Grace was never viewed as a statistic or an anonymous file. She was regarded as a real child with connections, someone's daughter, someone's grandchild, someone whose absence mattered far beyond paperwork or procedure. Public appeals continued, with officials urging anyone with information to come forward. Sheriff Joe Leonard acknowledged that the circumstances could have involved an accident, but stressed that unresolved questions remained. What troubled authorities most was that the child had not received a proper farewell, and that someone, somewhere, likely held the key to explaining how events had unfolded. Roughly a week later, forensic artist Lois Gibson was asked to create an illustration of what Baby Grace may have looked like while alive. Once released, the image generated an overwhelming response, producing tips from across the country. Some callers speculated that the child might be Madeleine McCann, a British girl whose disappearance had drawn global attention earlier that year. Investigators, however, were able to quickly rule out that connection. On November 6, 2007, a memorial was held on nearby Tiki Island. Community members gathered around a wooden cross bearing the words, "In loving memory of Baby Grace." After prayers, music, and shared reflections, the cross was transported by boat to the isolated island where she had been found, a quiet ceremony for a child whose life had ended without answers. Around this time, Nellie Ziegler heard news of Baby Grace on the radio and later saw the forensic sketch online. She learned that Ohio authorities were not caring for Riley and attempted to confront her son and Kimberly, believing Riley might have been abducted. Confusion turned into anger as questions went unanswered. Nellie and her husband demanded explanations, and when accusations of lying were exchanged, the confrontation escalated. Kimberly reacted with hostility and retreated upstairs, prompting Nellie to call out in frustration, questioning her lack of visible concern. Shortly afterward, Kimberly and Roy left the home, leaving behind silence, unresolved questions, and the uneasy feeling that the truth had quietly packed its bags and walked out with them. In the days that followed, Riley's grandmother, Cheryl Sawyers, came across the forensic image of Baby Grace online. The resemblance unsettled her. Riley had been missing from her life since May, and Cheryl knew the child had likely been living with her mother somewhere near Houston, only a short distance from Galveston. Trusting her instinct, she contacted the Galveston County Sheriff's Office, prompting investigators to begin connecting details that had previously seemed unrelated. At the request of Galveston authorities, Harris County Deputy Jones was sent to the couple's residence in Spring, Texas, to conduct a welfare check. Roy explained that an ongoing custody dispute existed with Riley's father in Ohio. Both Roy and Kimberly claimed that an Ohio CPS worker had arrived unexpectedly, removed Riley, and returned her to the state after an alleged altercation. Kimberly stated that Riley was now with her grandmother, or possibly another relative. When asked for documentation, Kimberly said records existed and would be sent through her attorney. A letter soon arrived, appearing to be from Ohio CPS and alleging concerns about Roy. It was later determined that the document had been fabricated. While Deputy Jones initially accepted the explanation, concern grew when Kimberly resisted filing any missing child report. Further verification with Ohio Child Protective Services confirmed that no case involving Riley existed. At that point, Deputy Jones requested a DNA sample from Kimberly to formally rule out the possibility that Riley was baby Grace. On November 23, 2007, Kimberly arrived at the Galveston County Sheriff's Office, accompanied by her attorney to provide the requested DNA. Investigators expected continued resistance. Instead, a detailed account was offered, as though cooperation had finally replaced avoidance, an abrupt shift that arrived far later than anyone would have hoped. Kimberly described meeting Roy through an online game and relocating to Texas shortly after marriage, where life initially seemed stable and promising. Over time, concerns about discipline surfaced. Roy reportedly voiced frustrations to coworkers, describing Riley as difficult to manage and expressing dissatisfaction with Kimberly's parenting approach. Suggestions from coworkers ranged from patience to consistency, eventually leading the couple to draft structured household rules covering routines, manners, and behavior. On paper, a tidy solution to a very human problem. Kimberly stated that Riley's behavior felt overwhelming beyond what she expected for a toddler, leading to increased timeouts. Roy reportedly insisted firmer measures were needed. What began as mild discipline escalated under his influence. Kimberly said she followed his guidance when he was present, and that Roy also began enforcing his own methods. What was framed as structure gradually took on a harsher meaning. Eventually, Kimberly told investigators that Roy declared he was exhausted by public incidents and the ongoing tension involving Riley's Ohio family. He announced plans to leave, offering continued financial support but emotional withdrawal. Faced with the possibility of being abandoned yet again, Kimberly pleaded for him to stay, promising that things would improve. The following day, July 24, 2007, Roy remained home from work, saying he wanted to oversee how Riley was being corrected. He insisted that discipline be immediate and severe, directing Kimberly to rely on a belt whenever Riley failed to meet his expectations. That morning, a small breach of manners was treated as defiance, and Roy framed obedience as something that had to be forced rather than taught. Formal language was demanded from a toddler, and what should have been guidance turned into repeated punishment throughout the day whenever Riley cried or resisted. As the situation escalated, Roy claimed stronger measures were necessary when Riley continued to scream. A cold bath was prepared, presented not as care, but as another tool for control. Each cry was met with further punishment, combining fear and discomfort in a way no child could understand. What was described as discipline became a cycle of distress, carried out under the belief that volume equaled authority. Eventually, there was a pause. Attempts were made to calm Riley with ice packs and medication, and for a short time she remained awake, trying to recover. Roy suggested the lesson had been learned, but that decision was quickly reversed. A harsher approach followed, marked by renewed aggression and frantic attempts to reassert control. Riley tried to move away but was repeatedly pulled back, her small body overwhelmed by adult force. Kimberly later admitted she participated as well, following Roy's instructions rather than intervening. At one point, Riley struggled to remain upright, but concerns were dismissed as exaggeration. During the chaos, Riley reached out to her mother and expressed affection. The moment briefly slowed events, but it was reframed as manipulation rather than a child seeking comfort, and the violence resumed. As the hours passed, Riley became increasingly weak. More medication was brought, but swallowing became difficult. It was then that the seriousness of her condition could no longer be ignored. Kimberly urged that emergency help be called, but Roy refused, aware that outside attention would bring consequences he wanted to avoid. Riley eventually stopped responding. Attempts were made to revive her, but they were unsuccessful. In the aftermath, Kimberly held her daughter, realizing life had faded away. The room grew quiet, marked by shock rather than relief, as the weight of what had occurred finally settled in. Afterward, Riley was placed in the bathtub, now used not for punishment, but for concealment. Roy instructed Kimberly to help clean the home and remove items that could draw attention. Practical decisions replaced emotion, as if organization might undo what had already happened. That evening, the couple went out together, stopping at a store to purchase supplies. They moved through the aisles like ordinary shoppers, filling carts with items that would later take on grim significance: plastic containers, cleaning products, and tools. To anyone watching, it likely looked like preparation for a household project, a cruel contrast to reality. Back at the house, efforts were made to erase evidence rather than confront loss. Riley was carefully dressed in pink, her favorite color, an act that felt gentler than anything that had come before. She was then wrapped and placed inside a plastic container, along with cement meant to weigh it down. In a final bitter irony, more care was shown in arranging the aftermath than had been shown in protecting her life. After the preparations were completed, the blue container was placed inside a storage shed behind the home, where it remained for several weeks. During that period, questions from Roy's parents increased, especially regarding Riley's sudden absence. Kimberly responded with a fabricated explanation, claiming Riley was temporarily staying with relatives in Plainsville, Texas, due to ongoing custody disagreements involving Cheryl Sawyers and Riley's father. The story was presented calmly, as though distance alone could explain disappearance. During later interviews, Kimberly stated that 2 unsuccessful attempts had been made to dispose of the container. On one occasion, the couple drove along a rural road where digging was attempted but abandoned due to difficulty in time. Another plan involved a bridge near Lake Houston, but concerns about visibility caused hesitation. Eventually, a trip was made to Galveston Bay, where the container was released from the causeway. Kimberly later described watching it drift away, an image that lingered long after the water carried it out of sight. Despite Roy's previous behavior, Kimberly later said her primary fear was not physical harm, but abandonment. In the weeks that followed, deliberate efforts were made to erase reminders of Riley's existence. Items connected to the child were discarded, particularly after the unidentified remains became public. It was during this time that the falsified Ohio CPS document was created, offering a paper explanation for an absence that could no longer be hidden. Shortly before his interview with investigators, Roy attempted to take his own life by ingesting a large quantity of medication. A handwritten note was left, stating that Kimberly bore no responsibility for his actions. The gesture, however, proved temporary. Once taken into custody, Roy distanced himself from blame, offering multiple conflicting accounts of the day Riley died. His explanation shifted repeatedly, placing himself elsewhere in the home or away entirely. Eventually, partial responsibility was acknowledged, framed as regret rather than confession. Following a search of the residence, both Kimberly and Roy were arrested on charges related to harm of a child and evidence tampering. Bail was initially set at a high amount and later increased. Investigators by this point were confident in the child's identity. DNA testing involving Kimberly and Riley's father confirmed what had already become apparent. The child known publicly as Baby Grace was Riley Ann Sawyers. Medical findings were presented through testimony from the forensic pathologist who conducted the examination. Due to the condition of the remains, some conclusions could not be definitively reached. However, injuries to the spine suggested repeated forceful movement of the head, and internal findings indicated significant trauma. Multiple fractures to the skull were consistent with extreme impact rather than an accident. Based on the totality of evidence, the cause of death was determined to be blunt force injury, and the manner was ruled a homicide. What had been treated for months as a mystery involving a nameless child was finally resolved with a name, a family, and a painful truth. In the end, the attempt to make Riley disappear only ensured that she would be remembered, an outcome no amount of planning could undo. Kimberly was found guilty of capital homicide on February 2, 2009. During the trial, jurors became visibly emotional while viewing her recorded interview, in which she described her actions and recalled her child's expressions of affection during the events in question. Defense attorneys argued that the outcome had not been planned and that Kimberly could not have foreseen such consequences arising from discipline. The jury rejected that reasoning, reaching a verdict in just 90 minutes. Prosecutors chose not to pursue the death penalty, citing the difficulty of meeting legal requirements tied to future danger. Kimberly received a sentence of life without parole and remains incarcerated at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. Roy was convicted later that year on November 6, 2009, for capital homicide and evidence tampering. Former co-workers testified about his unsettling demeanor, with some describing him as difficult to be around. Photographs entered into evidence showed Roy and Kimberly appearing relaxed at a social gathering shortly after Riley's passing, a contrast that did not go unnoticed by jurors. His defense claimed there was no proof of his involvement during the events leading up to Riley's death, despite admitting to actions afterward. The jury deliberated just over 4 hours before delivering a guilty verdict. Roy was sentenced to life without parole and is held at the Wallace Pack Unit in Navasota, Texas. Multiple appeals by both defendants have since been denied. While awaiting trial in June 2008, Kimberly gave birth to a baby boy at the age of 19. The child was immediately placed into protective custody, and adoption arrangements were made. Riley was deeply cherished by her father and extended family. Her father, Robert Sawyers, remembered her as joyful, imaginative, and full of energy. He spoke of her enthusiasm for life and her generally good behavior. Reflecting on Kimberly, he expressed disbelief that such harm could occur. Recalling how Riley was once clearly loved, the contrast between those memories and reality remained painful and difficult to reconcile. On January 14, 2008, after forensic examinations were completed, Riley's cremated remains were returned to her family. 2 Galveston deputies who had promised to bring her home honored that commitment by escorting her remains to Ohio and serving as pallbearers at her service. Riley's memory extended beyond her family. The small island in Galveston Bay where she was found was officially renamed Riley Island, a lasting tribute that transformed a place of tragedy into one of remembrance. Her obituary reflected both grief and faith. Speaking of innocence, love, and the belief that Riley was no longer alone, it asked for care and compassion beyond this world, expressing a family's hope that she was now safe and at peace. A wake was held on January 15th in East Lake, Ohio, close to where Riley had been born. Her small, handmade casket measured just 3 feet in length and was crafted from brown wood with a cross on top. The casket was donated by a man from Texas who had experienced the loss of a child himself. Inside were her ashes, a pink dress, and several stuffed animals, including her favorite Elmo. Services were held at St. Bede, the Venerable Church in Mentor, Ohio, followed by burial at Mentor Cemetery. Her gravestone bears an image of an angel and a smiling photograph, along with words honoring her short life. On the reverse side, a single name is engraved, Baby Grace. Approximately 200 people attended, and candlelight vigils were held across 14 countries, illuminating her memory far beyond Ohio. Riley's grandfather later remarked on the global outpouring of compassion. What began as a family's private loss had resonated worldwide. In his words, Riley had become more than their granddaughter. She had become a child remembered by many, a reminder that even the smallest life can leave an immeasurable mark. My take on this case, Riley Ann Sawyers' story shows how critical warning signs were overlooked. Escalating control, isolation, extreme discipline, sudden disappearance, and inconsistent stories should have triggered urgent intervention much sooner. When caregivers cut off access to family, refuse transparency, or justify harm as parenting, those are red flags that must never be ignored. To prevent tragedies like this, we need faster cross-state coordination. mandatory follow-ups on missing children, and a culture that treats concerns from relatives and community members as signals to act, not noise. If Riley's story moved you, please honor Riley Ann Sawyers by sharing this, staying alert to the signs, and supporting child protection efforts. Like and subscribe to keep these stories visible, because awareness can save lives.